Dylan had always known that silence could be louder than confession. It had kept her alive, hidden beneath the sterile corridors of the hospital where Luna's case once passed like a whispered storm, an incident folded neatly into archives and forgotten by those who had the privilege to forget. But memory had never been merciful to her. It followed her across towns, shifting faces and jobs, always hovering in the space between her heartbeat and the hum of fluorescent lights. When she arrived in Los Angeles, few knew her name, and fewer still knew that she had been there that night when the monitors went flat, when decisions made in haste turned a woman's life into a bargaining chip for the powerful. She told herself she had done the right thing by keeping quiet, that it had not been her place to question the doctors or the donors who owned half the hospital's wings. Yet the years had eroded that justification until it felt like a wound that never stopped reopening. Finn's name was one she had heard in passing long before she saw his face. He had been part of the review panel that signed off the final report on Luna's care, labeling it a tragic but unavoidable complication. He had believed in medicine's authority, in the clean lines of procedure and responsibility, until the day his own conscience began to fracture beneath the weight of revisionist truths. When Dylan walked into his clinic, no longer the anonymous nurse's aide from Luna's ward, but a consultant under a different badge, the air between them thickened with recognition neither could place. He saw in her eyes the kind of haunted knowledge that mirrored his own doubts. For months, he had begun to suspect that the records he trusted had been tampered with, perhaps even rewritten under pressure from donors whose names no one dared speak aloud. And at the center of those donors was Bill Spencer, a man who wore morality like a tailored suit, removable, impeccable, and always convenient. Bill had his reasons for wanting to bury Luna's story. She had once been under his company's scholarship fund, a bright face for Spencer Publications' philanthropic campaign. The accident that shattered her life had occurred during one of those charity events where cameras outnumbered compassion. If the truth ever emerged, that her pregnancy was mishandled under influence, that her consent had been altered through coercion, it would not only destroy reputations, but invite lawsuits that could sink empires. Bill understood leverage better than medicine. He had built his empire on perception, and perception could kill faster than disease. So when Dylan appeared on his radar, a woman who had once signed off on confidential reports and now reappeared with questions too precise, he didn't see a victim or a whistleblower. He saw liability. The moment Will overheard fragments of his father's tense conversation with a board member, the dynamic of the Spencer family shifted in ways no one immediately noticed. To Will, Dylan's name was a curiosity, a ghost woven into words like exposure, liability, and containment. He didn't understand the full scope, but he understood tone, the rare fear in his father's voice, the brittle urgency of control. It was enough to plant suspicion in his young mind that power wasn't as invincible as it looked. He began watching, listening, connecting dots that adults left scattered in their arrogance. Meanwhile, Dylan's moral dilemma festered. The documents she had retrieved, copied years ago when she thought she might need protection, contained signatures and timestamps that contradicted official reports. She had resisted opening them for so long that the digital files felt radioactive, pulsing with the ghosts of choices made under duress. Her return to Los Angeles wasn't coincidence, it was compulsion. Something in her refused to let Luna's story fade into polite silence. But exposing it meant reopening the trauma, risking lawsuits, retaliation, and the destruction of her own life. The hospital board had changed since then, yet the same currents of privilege ran beneath its polished surface. Finn had become the face of ethical medicine, but Dylan knew even he had once been complicit, not out of malice, but out of trust. Trust that the system worked. Trust that data couldn't lie. Trust that the living were worth more than the dead. Each step she took into the investigation drew her deeper into moral quicksand. Finn, torn between self-preservation and truth, began to realize that Dylan's questions mirrored his own unspoken guilt. The patient records, the lab results, the signatures, they all pointed to a cover-up more sophisticated than negligence. Someone had edited Luna's records to erase an experimental drug trial tied to Spencer-funded research. The drug, designed to stabilize pregnancy complications, had been withdrawn from testing after Luna's case, but its results had been rebranded as successful for the sake of investors. Finn's involvement had been bureaucratic. He had merely reviewed and approved based on the falsified data he was given. Yet ignorance offered no absolution. The thought that his own career had been built atop someone suffering clawed at him like a slow-burning disease. Bill's awareness of Dylan's return grew into paranoia. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but her quiet persistence unnerved him. She wasn't seeking money, publicity, or revenge. She was seeking truth, and that made her unpredictable. He sent subtle warnings at first, calls unanswered, meetings canceled, offers of employment that seemed too generous. When none of it worked, he turned to the old methods: surveillance, intimidation, whispers through legal intermediaries. But Dylan wasn't the same woman she had been years ago. Guilt had tempered her fear into resolve. For every threat that came her way, she gathered another piece of evidence, another witness, another inconsistency. It wasn't vengeance she wanted, it was absolution. Finn's conscience, once his compass, now became his tormentor. He began questioning his own memory of the events. Had Luna consented to the treatment? Had he overlooked anomalies because he trusted his superiors? The more he reviewed old files, the more he saw traces of manipulation, timestamps that didn't align, lab results rewritten in identical handwriting. His professional detachment crumbled under the realization that the patient's life he had deemed unrecoverable might have been deliberately compromised. And now, standing before Dylan, he faced the embodiment of everything he had tried to forget. Will's role evolved from passive observer to accidental catalyst. His discovery of an encrypted folder on his father's laptop, one labeled Spencer Foundation Compliance, wasn't deliberate snooping but curiosity. Inside, he found correspondence between the hospital board and the Spencer Foundation discussing media risk mitigation regarding Luna's case. It wasn't the language of care, it was the language of control. When he confronted Bill about it, his father's reaction was instantaneous and explosive, confirming Will's worst suspicion, that the man he admired had blurred the lines between protection and deceit. For Dylan, the stakes grew heavier as she realized that the only way to expose the truth was through Finn's testimony. Yet he remained the very man who might lose everything if he spoke. She watched him struggle between duty and denial, between the identity he had built and the truth that could dismantle it. There was a strange symmetry between them. She had sinned through silence. He had sinned through compliance. Together, they formed the perfect mirror of human weakness, the healer who had failed to heal and the witness who had failed to speak. Bill's corporate empire, so meticulously constructed, began to show cracks. Rumors circulated in boardrooms and among journalists who smelled blood in the water. His rivals saw opportunity, his allies grew restless. He doubled down on controlling the narrative, funding new hospital wings, launching charity initiatives to redirect attention. But beneath every press release lay a fear that Dylan's truth might surface at any moment. He underestimated her endurance. He had fought wars in business, but never against someone fueled not by greed, but by guilt. When Finn finally traced the inconsistencies back to the hospital's data servers, the realization shattered him. The system logs revealed unauthorized edits linked to a donor access terminal, the same terminal registered under Spencer Publications' medical research wing. It confirmed everything Dylan suspected. The alteration wasn't random, it was deliberate and sanctioned. He spent sleepless nights staring at the data, knowing that exposure would destroy not only his career but also the fragile trust patients placed in him. Yet silence, now equated to complicity. In that moral paralysis, Dylan's presence became both a burden and a beacon. Her resolve forced him to confront his own cowardice. Will, increasingly alienated from his father, began to correspond anonymously with a journalist, feeding bits of information that corroborated Dylan's story. It was a rebellion born not of hatred but of moral awakening, a desire to see truth prevail even if it fractured his family. When Bill discovered the leak, the betrayal cut deeper than any corporate loss. For the first time, He saw the cost of his control, a son who no longer believed in him, a legacy stained not by scandal but by moral decay. As Dylan prepared her final report for submission to the ethics board, she knew the consequences. There would be lawsuits, firings, perhaps even criminal charges. Her own career would be collateral damage. But her silence had already cost one life. She refused to let it claim another. Finn stood by her during the review hearing, his voice trembling yet unwavering as he admitted his oversight and endorsed her findings. It was a public confession wrapped in quiet courage. The hearing room fell silent as decades of institutional hypocrisy cracked open, revealing the rot beneath the marble. Bill's empire weathered the storm publicly, but not privately. Investors withdrew, partnerships dissolved, and for the first time in years, he faced scrutiny he couldn't outmaneuver. Yet even in ruin, he remained defiant. To him, Dylan's crusade was naive, a moral indulgence in a world built on compromise. But deep down, he knew she had done what he could not, confront the truth without calculation. Will's distance became permanent, his silence toward his father echoing Dylan's once destructive quiet, but this time born of moral clarity. For Finn, the aftermath was paradoxical. His career was tarnished, his reputation fractured, but his conscience, long paralyzed by denial, finally began to heal. He returned to the hospital not as a symbol of perfection but as a man willing to bear imperfection openly. Dylan vanished soon after the hearings concluded, her role completed, her presence lingering like a ghost that had finally spoken. Some said she moved north, others that she took a teaching position under a different name. For those who had known her only briefly, she became myth, a woman who dared to disturb the architecture of silence. In the end, the truth about Luna's case became less about the past and more about what people were willing to do to protect illusion. It wasn't just a story of a patient or a scandal. It was a study in how power rewrites memory, how morality bends under pressure, and how even the smallest voice, when driven by remorse, can fracture an empire. Dylan's journey wasn't about redemption but reclamation, the reclaiming of a conscience once surrendered to fear. Finn's was about surrendering pride for honesty, and Will's about inheriting not wealth but awareness. Bill, stripped of invincibility, was left to face the reflection he had avoided for years, a man who mistook control for strength and secrecy for protection. Underneath it all, Luna's memory persisted, not as a tragedy, but as the silent compass that guided every downfall and awakening that followed. Her name, once buried beneath reports and signatures, became the whisper that refused to die. And though Dylan's story ended in solitude, it resonated through every life she touched, reminding them that truth, however devastating, is the only form of mercy that endures. Brooke had always been the woman who waited by the door, dressed in grace and wounded pride, believing that love, especially hers, could outlast any betrayal. Yet this Thanksgiving was different. The laughter spilling from the Forrester mansion was not hers to share. Ridge had chosen Taylor again, folding himself into the warm illusion of family and tradition, leaving Brooke in a house that no longer felt like a home. The quiet that settled around her was deafening, filled with echoes of years spent forgiving, compromising, and believing that this time, things would be different. But as the hours passed and the candles in her dining room burned down to wax and shadow, Brooke felt something inside her shift, a stillness turning into steel. For decades, she had built her identity around the idea of being Ridge's great love, the one constant in his storm of loyalties. She had endured Taylor's returns, his children's resentment, the endless cycles of reconciliation and rejection. She had convinced herself that their story was destiny, that true love required endurance, not equality. But now, watching another holiday pass without him, she began to see her life not as an epic romance, but as a pattern, one in which she always played the forgiving half, the woman left standing while Ridge celebrated elsewhere. That night, as the city's lights shimmered against the windows, Brooke realized that devotion had become her prison. When Bill called the next morning with his usual blend of charm and precision, she hesitated only for a moment. His proposal was framed as business, a potential collaboration between Spencer Publications and Forrester's PR division. Katie, having recently been pushed aside in a company restructuring, was no longer in charge of the communications arm. It was the perfect opportunity for Brooke to step into a new kind of power, to reclaim a voice beyond the title of Ridge's ex-wife. Bill's motives were layered, as always. On the surface, he spoke of strategy, of brand synergy and female empowerment, but beneath it lay something more personal, a subtle, simmering revenge against Ridge for humiliating Katie and, by extension, himself. For Brooke, however, the proposal wasn't about vengeance. It was about rebirth. She could feel the undercurrents shifting in her daughter's world, too. Hope, once the moral compass of her generation, was shedding her gentleness like an old skin. The recent battles with Thomas, the struggle for creative control at Forrester, had awakened in her a taste for dominance. Hope no longer wanted to be a muse. She wanted to be a leader. And she recognized in Bill the ruthless precision she would need to achieve that. Where Brooke saw the partnership as a path toward independence, Hope saw it as a weapon, one that could tilt the balance of power within Forrester Creations and finally free them from the Forrester men's paternal grip. Together, mother and daughter formed an unlikely axis, their ambitions overlapping but not identical. Brooke's drive came from wounded pride, Hope's from emerging ambition. And Bill, watching both women with the calculating calm of a man who thrived on emotional chaos, knew he could turn this alignment into a storm that would consume Ridge's world. At first, the collaboration appeared harmless, a joint PR campaign spotlighting sustainable fashion and women's leadership in business. Brooke's name lent it credibility, Bill's media empire gave it reach. But beneath the polished surface, it was a statement. Every headline, every photo shoot, every interview subtly repositioned Brooke and Hope as the faces of progress, while Ridge and Taylor's domestic tableau began to look quaint, even obsolete. Bill understood optics better than anyone. He wasn't just building a campaign, he was building perception. And perception was power. When Ridge learned about the partnership, he brushed it off at first, dismissing it as another of Bill's attempts to stay relevant. But the more he saw, the glossy magazine spreads featuring Brooke and Hope, the interviews highlighting their vision for a new era at Forrester, the more he realized how effectively they were reclaiming the narrative. Brooke was no longer the woman waiting for his forgiveness. She was the woman redefining herself without him. Hope, too, had transformed from the idealistic daughter into a force of her own, commanding boardrooms with the same confidence her mother once reserved for romance. Taylor noticed the change as well. The peace she had hoped to build with Ridge began to crumble under the pressure of his unease. He became restless, haunted by the idea that he had misjudged Brooke, that perhaps her silence had not been weakness, but preparation. The image of her standing beside Bill in front of flashing cameras burned in his mind. The jealousy he tried to disguise as concern began to spill into his conversations with Taylor. Every time he mentioned Brooke's name, there was an edge to his voice, a trace of something deeper than anger, something closer to loss. Meanwhile, Bill's plan unfolded with the precision of a chess master. He had no illusions about Brooke's heart. He knew she would never fully belong to him. But possession was not his goal, influence was. Aligning with Brooke and Hope gave him leverage not only against Ridge, but against the Forresters as a whole. His media outlets began running stories that subtly questioned Forrester's leadership, drawing comparisons between the company's traditional hierarchy and the innovative new direction of Brooke and Hope's projects. Investors took notice. The balance of loyalty within the fashion house began to shift. Behind the glamour, however, Brooke wrestled with her conscience. Each success felt both empowering and hollow. She told herself she was finally being valued for her mind, her experience, her vision, yet she couldn't ignore the shadow of Bill's agenda hovering behind every move. She remembered too vividly how his charm had once veiled manipulation, how easily affection could become control. But the deeper she went, the harder it became to step back. The project had grown beyond her. It had become a cultural phenomenon, and walking away now would seem like defeat. Hope, in contrast, thrived in the chaos. For the first time, she felt the exhilaration of being feared rather than pitted. Her partnership with Bill gave her access to media platforms that made her voice impossible to ignore. But power is rarely shared equally. Bill began to test her boundaries, small suggestions at first, a headline here, a quote there, each designed to make the message more provocative, more polarizing. Hope realized too late that her campaign for empowerment was being subtly weaponized into a vendetta against the Forresters. And yet, a part of her didn't care. For years, she had been measured against Steffi, dismissed as softer, safer, less daring. Now, the same people who once overlooked her were calling her visionary. Ridge watched this transformation with a growing sense of dread. The women he had once tried to protect were now operating on a plane he could no longer control. His influence, once absolute, was dissolving in the tide of modernity they represented. Even Eric, long the patriarchal anchor of the family, began to acknowledge Brooke's campaign as a necessary evolution for the brand. That quiet endorsement hurt Ridge more than any argument could. For the first time, he was the outsider, the man on the wrong side of history. Thanksgiving had been the catalyst, but the fallout extended far beyond the holiday table. What began as a choice of comfort, choosing Taylor, choosing family, had evolved into a reckoning of identity. Ridge had believed he could separate personal affection from professional respect, but Brooke's defiance blurred those lines. He began to see how deeply he had underestimated her. The very qualities he once took for granted, her passion, her persistence, her belief in love, were now fueling a power he could neither contain nor diminish. Bill, ever the observer, sensed Ridge's unraveling. It amused him to watch his old rival squirm under the weight of consequences. But he also understood that chaos could be temporary. Eventually, alliances would shift again. Brooke might forgive Ridge, or Hope might outgrow his influence. To secure his position, he began laying new foundations, discreet acquisitions, quiet partnerships, an expanding network of influence that would ensure his presence remained essential even if Brooke walked away. For Brooke, redemption came not through revenge, but through realization. As the year drew to a close, she stood at the edge of a career renaissance she hadn't planned, but had undeniably earned. She had stopped defining herself through the men who alternately adored and abandoned her. Yet the price of autonomy was loneliness. Her success felt like standing atop a mountain after everyone else had turned back. Hope was still beside her, but even that bond was shifting. Mother and daughter now competitors as much as allies, their ambitions intersecting but never identical. When Ridge finally reached out, it wasn't with anger but confusion. He couldn't reconcile the Brooke he loved with the Brooke the world now admired. His apologies, once her weakness, no longer moved her. She had built too much, lost too much, to collapse at his feet again. Taylor, watching from the periphery, realized that love built on guilt could never survive. She saw in Ridge's eyes the recognition she had always feared, that he loved Brooke not despite her strength, but because of it, and that strength was now beyond his reach. The triangle that had defined decades of lives dissolved into something quieter but more profound, three people confronting the limits of their own illusions. Brooke, at last, understood that being chosen was not the same as being valued. Ridge learned that loyalty built on habit is not love. And Taylor, perhaps the most self-aware of them all, saw that peace cannot be built on someone else's indecision. As winter descended on Los Angeles, the lights from Forrester Creations' holiday gala reflected off the city's glass towers, a mirror of ambition and loss. Brooke arrived not as a guest, but as an equal partner in the brand's future, her presence commanding the room with the calm of someone who had finally accepted her own worth. Bill watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, knowing that he had helped forge the storm but could not control its aftermath. Ridge stood near the entrance, unseen by most, realizing that for the first time in his life, he was the one left standing outside the door. And somewhere deep within her, Brooke felt the ache of old love mingling with the quiet pride of survival. She didn't need forgiveness or validation anymore. The woman who once lived for someone else's approval now lived for her own truth. In the faint reflection of the ballroom lights, she saw not the lover scorned or the mother wounded, but the architect of her own resurrection, a woman who had turned humiliation into legacy and heartbreak into power. The story that began with rejection ended not with reunion, but with clarity. And in that clarity, Brooke finally found the peace she had spent a lifetime mistaking for love.